Hello and welcome to the Warrior Artist Podcast, a resource full of practical advice and insights into artist practice to inspire you on your creative journey. My name is Éadaoin Glynn, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Irish visual artist Nuala O Donovan. Nuala builds beautiful sculptural forms in porcelain clay based on the patterns and geometry of living organisms. She originally studied architectural drawing and environmental design, followed by metal and glass at Middlesex University in the UK. And after her return to Cork, where she is now based, she completed an MFA by research with the Crawford College of Art and Design. Nuala has exhibited and published internationally, has won many awards, including the Golden Fleece, and her work is in many important public collections, including the Irish National Art Collection. Nuala, hello and welcome to the Warrior Artist Podcast. How are you today?
Oh, good. Thanks for inviting me, Éadaoin. It's great to be included in these kinds of projects, I think. So thanks for asking me.
I was so happy you could join us because I've been a long-time admirer of your work, and I just found it fascinating when you sent me the information to research about it. It just gave me a whole other level of understanding, which I think would be really interesting for our listeners. And you initially studied architectural drawing and design, and did you ever consider going to art college at that time?
I did. Actually, I applied to loads of art colleges when I left school, but it was more of, at the time, there was very few artists actually earning a living. Though people talk about the lack of support now, but then there was really very little support. So I wanted to travel. That was my main thing. I wanted to work abroad and I wanted to travel. And so I applied to the art schools, and a vanity thing to get in. And then I went to a technical university, which was MTU, and I studied construction studies, drawing and detailing, because I knew you could work anywhere. Drawing's a universal language, even in architecture. So you can, at the time, hand drawings. So you could, even if you didn't speak the language, you could still do the drawings. So it was really as a sort of facilitator of travel. And so that's what I did. I actually had a plan, which is, I look back and I'm amazed because I was so scattered at the time. But yeah, I did have some sort of focus. But I always loved art. I would always do night classes in different crafts, and also I always painted and I always drew. So I kept it up as well, but I suppose they're very closely linked as well. All of those professions are. Art has always been there, but to earn a living is technical drawing, really, draftsmanship.
And then you studied glass and metal.
Yeah, I think
Why? That's so interesting.
when I came back to London after being in Australia and working there, I wanted to study design, but I wanted to study sort of pure design rather than designing from styles. I wanted to do a course where you worked on materials, and it was about more of a fine art and materials approach to design, because I was moving sideways rather than changing direction completely. And in Middlesex, it was really a fine art approach there. So you had a choice. You could do furniture, ceramics, metal or glass. So I did metal with glass as my sort of minor. So it was major metal, minor glass. I was kind of inspired by a lot of the work that was going on in London at the time, in particular in metal. There was a lot of like Andrew Dubray, and it was a different approach. It was the beginning of one-off pieces that were like Mark Newson's work. It was art, but it was functional. And I thought that kind of suited me from the background I was coming from. In a sense, that's why I did metal. Yeah. And I loved working in it as well. But I went back in once I finished that course. I was absolutely broke and owed money. So I combined it with my technical background and then started working in interiors offices doing design. I constructed my own qualification in a sense, but it was quite a valuable thing to have the technical background and the knowledge of materials that I had. It was another area of work I really enjoyed. I love materials. I love seeing how they work together and how you detail them so that they can function, and also aesthetically. I didn't go into renting a studio working because I just couldn't afford it. I had to pay rent.
Well, that's the real life world.
I know, there you go.
When did you move into ceramics? It was interesting that you had the option of ceramics in that course and you chose metal and glass. So when did that happen? Because ceramics is your primary material. When did you start working in ceramics?
When I was teaching at MTU, I was teaching design studio in the interior architecture course, because that was my background at that stage. And I was going to do an MA mainly because my daughter was in school then. And like with most women, I'd gone part-time, I was teaching, my skills had fallen behind and I needed to kind of leapfrog back into the jobs market. And so I decided to do an MA. At the time, I was doing my never-ending evening classes, and I was doing an evening class in ceramics with Orla Boyle and Sarah Flynn, both of them teaching. And Roisin Collins, they had the ceramics course at the time, and they suggested to me after the year, it took me a whole year to make a piece, but I didn't really mind. But they suggested that I might want to look into this 1 year. They had a 1 year open-ended post-grad year at the time available, where there was no outcome and you could just go and play around with the material or explore. And I thought, before I commit to staying in the design world, I'll just try this because it's something that I love. And if it works, then I'll go that direction. And it did. I really enjoyed that year. And I'd found a language by the end of that year. Then I applied to do the MA course in that department. It did take a year actually to define what I was going to do. And then I started on that research. So once I started, I knew exactly what I was going to do on that course. And it was by research. I think I was the only MA student at the time. Now it's much more structured. With the help of Orla Boyle, she was my supervisor, we decided what I'd do. I did exactly what I wanted. It was wonderful. It was like taking 2 years out from being an adult. My daughter was in primary school next door in St. Finbarr's. I had a different schedule to everyone else. I started at 8, I dropped her off, finished at 2, picked her up. So that's how I worked it. And then worked in the evening as well. So I worked around her schedule, really. But yeah, I really enjoyed those 2 years. They were fantastic. It's a real indulgence to be able to talk to people a lot about your work and explore things and discuss things.
Was it ceramics, the material that you connected with, or did you explore other materials?
I didn't look at other materials because I had the facility to work in ceramic, and I have worked in metal before. But after I did the year of exploration, clay did what I wanted to do. I wasn't in love with clay, but I found porcelain an amazing material. It's plastic. One wonderful thing about it is on the making stage, you don't really need any equipment expense-wise. So I was able to make what I wanted to make with clay. If it had happened that it wasn't suitable, I probably would have used another material. If the idea is more important to me than the material, and I like the form or the piece to exploit the material in a sense. And the qualities of porcelain is that I can make those elements, all the elements that are built, very quickly out of clay. And it doesn't involve any equipment. It's silent work, which is good. It's handy. And there was a transformative process in the firing that I really loved. There's a huge amount of movement. So the piece is not quite as you make it. The quality changes. And I loved that stage in the process.
And you like unglazed as well. Why is that? Is that the deliberate choice?
It is, yes. First of all, my pieces were so complex and all my research was into form and pattern. And I felt that color was a whole other area of research and I didn't have time to do it. And when I was looking at color, I felt that it separated the form. If you use color, you use glaze. And also when the clay is unglazed, when it's high-fired unglazed porcelain, it's a bit like cast glass in that it absorbs light rather than reflecting it. And if you glaze it, it reflects it. And I didn't want it to be a surface texture. I wanted the structure to be as one, including the surface. I wanted it to be one piece. And I tried using color, but what I do is I color the clay. It's stained, so it's the whole way through, and I'm quite happy with that. I've tried a few bits with glaze, but it just doesn't do it for me. I think it changes the character of the work to be more about the material than the form. I hope that does that kind of...
It does make sense. It's because
Yeah.
the form is so distinct. These beautiful, what I saw first were these beautiful organic forms. And can you tell us where your inspiration comes from?
I've always loved functional pattern. I love it as a communication, as a device for communication. I felt my background, my upbringing in Ireland and my culture in a sense is Like I would have gone to the Crawford Gallery when I was growing up, and all my family were very creative in that made things, and some of them painted as well. So there was a real interest in the arts, but very limited exposure outside of church buildings, really. And that's where you saw art in general, like paintings and sculpture and good and bad. It tended to be, I think maybe it gave me an affection for over decorated surfaces. When I traveled, I loved seeing inside mosques and other religious buildings where every surface is decorated and an expression of something. And because it's so intense, it becomes one thing. It's not just one exquisitely carved piece of wood. I wanted my work to have that kind of intensity so that the level of detail in the pattern, it doesn't overwhelm, but it blinds you to the detail. There's so much of it. It's like grass. It's all a little bit different, a little bit varied, but when you see it en masse, it reads as one thing. I wanted to use pattern in that way, that it was a kind of unifying, very densely worked piece. And I quite the slow building as well that comes with that. And it even goes back to my initial work as a detailer, that I am really into the detail. But when I started working in pattern, and I was going to use Islamic pattern in particular, and the kind of Western tradition in terms of religious buildings, and which are really what drove Western artists, that I found them very regular, and I started making pattern, and I found it uninteresting that you knew what the outcome was going to be. So I started looking into fractal geometry and allowing events that happen during the making, allowing imperfections and following those imperfections and irregularities so that the outcome at the beginning of the piece is unknown. So I used pattern from nature because they're structural patterns and they're functional pattern. And then I used regular geometry from classical geometry to decide on the proportions of the piece. And then I use fractal geometry to build it, but I still keep it within classical geometry in terms of proportion. But I'm interested in the whole symbolism of geometry as well, like the square and the circle and the kind of language within it. We just don't read it anymore, but I quite like the idea that within Gothic buildings, that certain shapes, certain forms, certain geometry was used because it symbolized heaven and earth, or protection, or exclusion, or inclusion. So that's how my pieces come about, really, pattern and form. Form was the most difficult. Pattern is endless, and you could make loads of little sample squares of pattern because the source material is endless. I quite like working within rules and constraints. I follow them from traditions.
Can you explain a bit more about the constraints that you use? Do you use constraints so that the form of your finished work is consistent with the source material? Is it like a mathematical formula that everything has to be a certain ratio? How does it actually work, this constraint that you're creating, and how do you use it in your work?
I use the rules of fractal geometry. Fractal geometry was defined in the 1980s by a mathematician called Mandelbrot, and he wrote a wonderful book explaining it by actually putting it into layman's terms. And it looks at what would have been defined as ugly geometry back in the 1900s. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, there was a big resurgence and interest in the geometry of natural forms. It would have been used in Art Deco, and all of that geometry at the turn of the 19th, 20th century was based on classical geometry, which would have been taken from nature as well. But it's very regular. It's the golden section, where it's a proportion of 1 to 1.618, roughly that kind of proportion. And like in the Greek tradition, they believed that for something to be beautiful and harmonious form, that the adjacent proportions should be a consistent ratio. And that would be the ratio that was used, because it's found in the human body a lot. So they used it in figurative sculpture to make the sculptures more dynamic, more lifelike. So that was one of the principles. It was adjacent proportions, repeated ad infinitum. And when I was looking at fractal geometry, it was the same thing within that, because the characteristics of that are self-similarity. So you have the adjacent proportions. Each thing increases by the same proportion. And then there is regular irregularity. That's in my work, where it's handmade and it's similar and it's regular to some degree, but it's regularly irregular. And then the other one was a response to random events. The typical fractal geometry would be in a tree, in plants, in clouds, in riverbeds. And if you think about, say, with a tree, you have a single branch, which typically goes to two branches, and then those two branches go two and then two. And it divides out from the macro to the micro. But because of the way it behaves, it has a certain form. No two trees are the same. You look at them and you say, I know that's an oak tree because that's what oak trees look like. Or I know that's a cloud because there is a geometry within it and it's a repeating of the same thing. And that responds to events. So you have two trees, you might plant them next to each other. They won't be the same because one will get slightly more sun or slightly more water. If you use those principles, it means that you have very similar pieces. You can recognize them as the same source. But each time you make one, it'll be different because it's being made through a different time. The elements are handmade, and also you use the same principles, same geometric principles. They will always be different. So I suppose I have the classical, which is I decide on the first dimension, which may be a diameter of something, or I'll say, okay, the length has to be X, and so the height will be X multiplied by 1.6, and the width could be that divided by 1.6. And for some pieces, like my grid pieces, I'll repeat that in the adjacent layers and the size of the elements. So it's an infinite repetition of a very simple process.
So you're inspired, taking your inspiration from nature, you come up with a constraint, which is like a mathematical formula, and then you make your pieces by hand.
Yeah.
So when you're creating, some of them are thousands of individual components that you've made by hand, and you're following this constraint. Do you know at the beginning what the overall shape will be, like the oak tree? Or are you following the forms that you're creating and you don't know what the end outcome will be? And also, how do you know when you're finished?
Some of my pieces are never finished. I keep finishing them. If they're still in my studio, they're not finished. There's one group of pieces that I made based on the radiolaria. They're grids. I started off making the cuboid forms. And then what I did with that was I looked at the radiolaria, and that's layers of different structures and patterns. And this is what I do with all of them. I take one single section of the pattern. And because I'm taking one section out and applying a different principle, then the form is different to the source material. It communicates the quality of the geometry rather than the quality of the source material. A lot of people think my work is corals or underwater organisms, because the geometry of fractals would be more typical of corals, and also they're not affected by gravity because they're underwater. I would take a single element, and then the form has to resemble the element of the pattern. With those, the reason they evolved into the drums or the cylinders was that the single elements were basically cylinders. They were solid cylinders, so I thought the form should be the same. Now with those, because it's so regular, I would know exactly what the outcome would be. But then I did move them on to being quite chaotic pieces, where they start off with that grid, and then by the time they're out to the outer layer, it's a sort of chaotic assembly of rods, but still conforming more to the fractals. With most of the other pieces, because they're more kind of organic shapes, I don't really know what it'll be like when it's finished. I know what size it'll be as you're working, as you're going along. And I think this is the thing with artwork. But you have to be driven on by a desire to see the outcome. Because if you knew what the outcome was going to be, then there's no point making it, I think. You'd be bored if you knew what it was going to be. a lot of artists, I think, are like this, where they're very, I don't know what's the word, ambiguous or few about commissions, because you've immediately got an expectation of the person who commissioned something. And also the expectation is it will be similar to something they've seen already. And so I think for most artists, it's about exploration or unintended outcomes or discoveries. So that's why when I make my work, I tend to make it and then it goes to exhibition. It's made, photographed, and finished. I don't really make work for other people.
That's probably a constraint you don't want. You mentioned radiolaria. Can you explain what that is?
It's a microscopic organism. And I took the drawing from a book of prints from the early 20th century by Ernst Haeckel. And he did this book in support of Darwin's theories to say, look, actually, most living organisms, when you look at them, it's difficult to tell which one is which. They all have something similar. They're the kind of reoccurrence of certain things within living organisms, like the number 5. It's a reoccurring kind of pattern. If you cut an apple open, it'll be a pentagram inside. Most living organisms work on 5 or odd numbers rather than even numbers. If you look at your hand, you've got 3 sections to every finger, and then I suppose you have 2 hands, which kind of defeats that.
Stars, snowflakes, they're all odd numbers.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And it comes from when you look back at a theory of how art evolved, it all came from numbers. It all came from geometry, because most living forms conform to it. And then art was based on that. There's this term, the logos, which was, I think, in Greek art, and it's looking at the oneness of things. It almost describes fractal geometry in a sense. You have these things which are singular, but multiple within. Because in that quote that I sent you about within each living organism is a reasoned tale. And when you look at it, you think, oh, that's the outcome, and the outcome makes sense. I think it's very interesting how things grow, and I did a lot of study into that as well. What drives things to grow and what affects it, like gravity, and where underwater you have no gravity and things grow in a certain way. And then above water, in earth, things grow in a different way, but there's a kind of symmetry with trees where you have the branches and you have the roots, and there's a kind of mirroring. Even when you see living forms and they're scarred or something has happened and the pattern's off, but then you see it like force that puts it back on that growth pattern, and it just continues on despite the blips and curves. I just find that really interesting. It's just a life force. We just understand very little, I think, really about life and how things grow.
You mentioned your interest in pattern and geometry in art. I'm just wondering, what were the ones that you were really interested in, and where do you see your work connected to that history of geometry and art?
My interest in Greek art really was that in Greek classical art, they adhered very rigidly to that idea of proportion and measurement. And I just found it really interesting in how that knowledge was transmitted and how also it's gone through history. Maybe it's a knowledge that I thought was disregarded in a sense. And I liked their aspiration to beauty. I think that's in Eastern art as well. It's a different interpretation where the beauty is in the transient, and there is a beauty in something that is only there for a limited amount of time. I suppose it's an aspiration to the divine. And that came from Greek art, then Roman art, and then these societies like the Pythagoreans that considered geometry and the knowledge of geometry to be this sacred knowledge. It was secret. And then that came down through the Masons and the Gothic cathedrals, and then the misinterpretations of geometric symbols like the pentagram. I thought it was interesting how these principles were used up to the very much so in the Gothic cathedrals. That knowledge of geometry had within it an understanding of balance and proportion and stability and just the way that materials would behave. And when I was looking at either end of the spectrum, looking at the more recent work and the sort of breaking point of if you have a drop of water and you stretch it, and where does it break? It was like materials had an energy. Geometry described it. I suppose maybe that's the best way I can put it. So I just found that was interesting, that you could control a material up to a point, but there were certain rules that it would always conform to. And I used to see that as well when I would fire work, and it would maybe go beyond some of those proportions. But you'd fire it, and because it's moving and it's moving into a position in a sense where it's strongest, that it'll stop moving when the structure holds it. And it would often settle into those proportions, even if it hadn't at the start. So when it was under stress, to maximize its strength, it would almost like it had a mind of its own. So it would freeze it in the proportions that the rules said it was supposed to be in.
Your work is primarily inspired by living organisms, but during your residency, you were inspired by the scaffolding around Notre Dame.
And in a sense, that was inspired by living organisms as well, because I was there during COVID. I think everyone became very conscious, including myself, of climate change and this whole thing of the tiny virus. And we think we're all powerful, but the world economy's commerce was shut down by something that was beyond all of our control. It's like when people build on floodplains and they put up walls and they think it's going to hold out a river that's in flood. There was that consciousness of power of nature and, in a sense, the human race's arrogance about our own achievements. I was going past Notre Dame because I was in the cultural centre and I had a 1 kilometre limit to where I would walk. So I used to walk past there every day, and not to boast or anything. The fire there devastated the building. Notre Dame is an enormous reliquary for the Crown of Thorns, which is like this series of structures getting smaller and smaller to protect this, on the surface, valueless, but really culturally incredibly valuable piece of this relic. All along the banks of the river outside Notre Dame, there's these beautiful big trees along the banks. And I thought, there's all of this huge effort and expense going into restoring this cathedral, and it'll never be the same again because it's new. There isn't that memory when you go in there. I don't know if one can ever recreate something. I was looking at the trees thinking, we as humans think this massive cathedral is this huge achievement, but we have not gotten to the stage where we could actually build a tree or anything as complex as a tree, which is a multifunctional, incredibly resilient. It cleans the air and it has this cycle of losing leaves and regenerating itself. And it does so many things. It enriches the soil. So I thought, what if we looked at what is now valueless in our society, which is a tree, if this environmental crisis keeps going to what the climate scientists say will happen? Will a tree become the most precious thing? It was also to do with the way I was working, where you reconstruct something from a fragment. I wasn't able to do the project I'd gone over for. I talk about creating beautiful forms from simple elements. And here I am in a courtyard and I have thousands of ready-made elements at my disposal. There were chestnut trees there and it was the autumn, winter. So there was all this material and I thought, okay, if I apply the principles to those. But as I was looking, I was thinking, it was the relic thing that got me then, when you have a single stem of a leaf or a horse chestnut case that encloses the seed. And you look at that in isolation, it's incredibly beautiful. So I thought, what about if we treated trees in the same way and you have these fragments and maybe you don't know what a tree looks like anymore, maybe it's post-apocalyptic. How would you reconstruct it? How would you even attempt that? So it was taking those elements and placing them within a framework of what would be considered more valuable. And it was really the materials I had to hand and experimenting with that, which I really enjoyed, actually, more than the research I was going to do. So it was an interesting accident. And I think the more I thought about them, the more I thought, where I grew up, we would have climbed trees a lot. And I just thought about the experience of being in a tree. It was wonderful. It was kind of that whole thing of the way children experience the world now and the way I experienced it, which was, if you were sent outside, if it wasn't raining, and you didn't go back till your dinner was ready. It was this very direct experience of the natural world, and very free. And I don't know if a lot of children get that now. I thought if somebody gave you the option of an experience as an adult, what is not available to you anymore, it's that kind of thing of just sitting in a tree.
Very interesting you said that about childhood, because you talked about the infinite possibility of material and system of making, taking apart and making again. And that reminded me of how we play as children. When we might have our box of blocks, and we make things and we take them apart, we make them again. And each time it's different with the same elements. What did you play with as a child?
We had a lot of animals. We wouldn't have had a lot of toys. I suppose my time of play, because my parents grew most of their own food. I was born in the city, but even in the city, my family had some land where they would have grown their own food. My grandparents would have grown their own food. When they moved to a country area, we did grow a lot of our own food, and so would have had direct contact with animals as well. We had our own milk. I would have had an idea of how things worked, like very basic farm machinery and that kind of thing. But in the times when we didn't actually have to help out with that, it was very much open air. We would have built cabins, and we did play in ruins. And my friend and I, we would have had a den where we made all the carpets. I think we made a fitted kitchen, whatever was at home, out of packaging. We did use a lot of natural materials. I remember we made fitted carpet out of moss, and it was this old farmhouse. We had it wall to wall of moss. I think there's a housing estate there, so we didn't do too much damage. The damage came after us. There would have been a lot of big families of children. We would have had a lot of that kind of territorial thing of building camps. Quite a lot of building camps, actually. Maybe that's where I got that idea of structure.
Describe your studio. Where is it? What's it like? And how do you work?
At the moment, my studio is up the road. It's in a garage. It used to be a stable, was originally a stable, and then it was a mechanic's garage. Now it's my space with very much a very old stone walls, which is nice to have that history actually, because it's from the 1800s. This stable, one of there, I think, of the people that occupied it for me. I still have all the car badges from the mechanic. Fiat Punto. I think he quite liked the badges because they're all upper low. But it's mainly stone, and it's got a kind of lime stroke, kind of basic concrete floor, which needs to be replaced. But it's nice because I've got a lot of space there. From the time that I graduated, I was always renting space. I have a lot of stuff with my work because my work is fragile to transport. So I have a lot of boxes and bubble wrap, even my kilns. So when I move into a space, usually half the space is for that stuff. And for a good few years, I really missed being able to see my work. It would be in boxes, it would be wrapped away. And so it's hard to progress work if you can't see the last piece that you made. I had residency in Dublin for a year, and I just moved back. So now I've got all my work out, and I'm going back and revisiting quite a lot of older work, working with metal again. And I want to combine natural ready-mades with the pieces that I've made in porcelain. And then the junction of the two is something that interests me. I want it to be a very obvious junction of the two materials. I was looking at Louise Bourgeois' work. I'd seen it in images, as everybody has. And I loved the quality of a drawn line in her work, particularly those large mother spider pieces. And to me, they looked like they were an ink drawing translated into a three-dimensional form. But when I looked up close, it was in this incredibly rough welding. And it was the knee joints of where it turns. To strengthen it, it was just bits of metal welded on to make this, not a swelling, but a kind of quite a strong joint of where the structure turns. And I really loved the quality of that, because I love seeing how things are made. I'm not really that interested if someone really finishes something and you can't see the join, you can't see how it went together, you can't see, was it press molded, was it welded, was it mechanically fixed? I like seeing that. And I thought when I saw her work, it changed direction for me a bit, where I just thought I want to amplify the way of making how the thing is made and amplify the junctions and the mix of material, really show you the qualities of the other material. It's like the way jewelry does it, where it has this one thing, and because of the way the other material holds it or points to it, it really makes the detail and the quality of each material. That's what I'll be doing now this year. And it's great to have the space to put the things out. It's almost like that constant evolution of work that's in my studio. Apparently, it is a danger if I still have it. And I think, oh, there's something that bothers me about that. And it's bothered me for 2 years, but now I know what I'll do with it. That's what I'm going to do this year, now that I've got space again and all my work unpacked.
And your work is so fragile and delicate. I was going to ask you about the storage and the practicality. Do you have them out on shelves? How are you viewing them?
I have them out basically on tables, and I have my own plinths that I had them made for my work because I wanted the plinth to be not just to complement the work, but to be almost another part of it, that it would be consistent with the piece. And I wanted to show work together. I didn't want there to be just one piece, one plinth. For the kind of work I make, that's often the way it's displayed. But I think the work all relates to each other, it speaks to each other, and I like that dialogue. So I have lots of pieces on a table, and I'll just move them around and see, how does this work with this, or small fragments and large fragments and finished pieces. But it's interesting when you put things with something else, it changes them. And then I have my work tables, which are unlike the building that they're in. They're white, melamine, pristinely clean. Laboratory like. The surface I work on, I have to keep it clean because it's porcelain. And then I have a separate section for doing the metal work. It's only small work. I'm basically using jewelry techniques. It's just very concentrated. So that's a separate space. And then if I use stained clay, I have a separate table and a whole set of instruments or equipment for that. It's all very compartmentalized, but in a big space.
So you're going to be exploring, revisiting the past, and then looking at new ways of connecting and joining and going back to your early study in metal as well. Are you actually going to use some of the older work? It must be very tempting to just add them in and take pieces of them and bring them into new work, or are you just observing them?
Oh no, I'm going to use the old pieces. I'm
Oh.
hacking them.
Cannibalizing them.
I'm improving them. The thing is, when you make the work yourself, I know that if someone buys the work or acquires the work, it's probably quite nerve-wracking, but when I've made it, I don't have any qualms about handling it. I would be upset if I broke something during the making because I feel like I'd wasted my time. But once I've made it and I know it and I've seen it, that's the end of the process for me, unless I'm going to change it. But then it's going on to be another piece. I'm going to use the work that I have because I think it's so much better as a combination than it was originally. And I can increase the scale or play with it that way, play with visual weights by using different materials and maybe using a thin line to enclose a large space, which makes the piece much larger, but visually, weight-wise, if I'm using a heavy material, it balances. So I'm hoping to work with an artist in Cork who works in metal and to use some casting techniques to try and get that drawn line quality. But it's moving on from what I rediscovered drawing this year to then put that into the three-dimensional pieces. I think it's always really exciting. It's kind of old new. It's a new way of working.
It sounds really interesting. I can't wait to see what you make.
You may
No,
never
it's-
see it. You may never see it.
It sounds like you're going to be having a lot of fun in the studio creating all this. And when you're working, Nuala, do you work on one piece at a time, or do you have multiple pieces going on your pristine tables at different stages?
I'd have multiple pieces because they're slow. And I have a kind of rules that I've made up myself. I don't know if they're really scientific, and they relate back to building again. When you're building a stone wall, not a stone wall, it's blockwork wall, you can only go 3 layers. You have to let the mortar dry. My work is a bit the same because I'm working with partially dry clay. It's green clay, but I'm also then putting in wet clay too, so they'll adhere to each other. It's unfired clay. It's a material that can react. You do something now and you might not see the reaction for an hour. You have to be careful about how much water you put into a structure before you let it dry. When I was trying to push things and rush things, sometimes I would build a whole big part of it. It'd be there all day for a couple of days. But because it wasn't drying, what would happen would be there would be a point where it just said enough and the whole thing would collapse. And it could be 2 days from when I should have stopped. So I make it, I do my 3 layers, it dries, I move on to the next thing, and I go on a circular motion. But then, like everybody, I have to be doing a day or two on the computer. So I actually don't have a huge amount of time in the studio. Almost like you have to fight for that time, because by the time you've done all the other things, even keeping up with social media, we're all doing marketing. And as we were discussing there, you have to become a sort of semi-technical expert.
Referring to my technical problems before we started, figuring out a new mic and new setup, with thanks to having a teenage son who came through and helped me. It's all learning. What is the balance of your week in terms of computer admin days versus creative days? You said about 2 days. Is that right? 2 days admin, 3 days creating?
I'd have to really try very hard. And sometimes it bleeds into the weekend quite a lot, and it bleeds into the evenings because you're thinking about it all the time. I don't know if there's enough hours in the day to have this. Sometimes I'd work in the evening. I'd go up to my studio in the afternoon after I'd done stuff in the morning. And then when you get into something and you're making, the hours, time just flies by, and at 8 or 9 o'clock, and I think, oh, I better go home. I think wouldn't it be wonderful to have somebody who does all that sort of stuff, like your tax return, your receipts, and social media.
Yes. Yes, maybe we'll share one. What is your least favorite of all the admin? Do you apply for grants and residencies? Are you spending a lot of time with that kind of application work as well?
I do, and I hate it. I think I'm really bad at it. I tend to leave it to, it's just my heart sinks when I see that you have to do another statement, and it has to be slightly different than the last one. It has to be focused. And it makes me angry as well, which makes it even harder to work because I'm giving out about it in my head. And my anger is that in all the arts now, I think that the skill that one needs most is to be a good writer. And I think that it's unfair because my language is visual. And I feel I communicate whatever I want to communicate through my work. Visual, it's sculptural, in particular through my 3D work, although I love drawing. And I think that's my language. Why can't I just put some images in? I think, why do I have to explain my work in a very academic way, referring to texts and justifying it? I think that if they made writers do paintings of their work, then I would maybe feel a little bit sort of justified, because I just think that medium, I can write, but it's as foreign to me, it's as difficult for me as a writer having to do a painting. If you said to a poet, well, you have to do a painting of your poem now.
I agree with you. I think everyone hates writing applications. Having said that, Nuala, when you sent me all the written material to prepare for this, it did give me insight into your work that I didn't know beforehand, and it actually made it more interesting to look at the visual aspect of it. So I think it did give me something I didn't know, because I suppose the thing about writing and reading is that something we can all do, whereas I paint, I don't know how to make ceramics, so I'm interpreting it differently, and I didn't know all the layers and the research and the geometry, and it made it so much more interesting. I think you write very well anyway. How do you handle rejection then?
I get cross because I've wasted all the time. And I think I shouldn't have wasted my time. I should have just gone and done something I enjoyed. I think it's really hard. I was talking to someone about this. This is the only profession where you're consistently told you're not good enough. Consistently. And then every so often someone says, oh, yes, we do think you're good. We do think your work is good enough, or your work is interesting enough. And I just think it's because it's the only profession where you have to do that, where you have to keep not proving yourself, but you have to keep justifying yourself. Usually when I get a rejection, it does make me look at how I'm working and maybe a different way of working, not so I can get funding, so I can avoid applying for it.
That's a good idea.
You know what it's like? It's, I don't know if you ever buy a lottery ticket. And when you go up to the machine, because I'm too lazy to check the numbers, and I don't really believe I'll win, but I have the secret little part of you that thinks one day you might. And I buy them like very sporadically. And when you take it up to the machine and it just says not a winner,
That's the way it makes you feel, the application process. That's my goodness. I'm surprised if you feel like that, because you're for somebody like me, you seem like you've achieved so much and you've won some very prestigious awards and you're in amazing collections. So you still feel like that sometimes?
Oh, I get loads of rejections. I just don't tell anyone about it. You see me on the street muttering with my headphones on.
She's got another no.
It was not a winner. I just see the effects of it. And in a sense, I'm not as reliant on funding because I tend to concentrate on selling my work and I deal with galleries that sell it. And so I can fund my practice that way. It would be nice to be able to take time out from that and to be able to develop work without that pressure of having to exhibit and sell constantly. But I can't complain because I have that alternative. Because I was working when I was in Dublin, I was in a kind of much bigger group of hugely different disciplines, theatre and performances, musicians and writers and that whole spectrum of the arts. When the results would come in on funding day, there was just this devastation. And it was bad for the people who were rejected, but it was also bad for the people who got it. Because you don't want to be saying, oh, I got it. Because you're making the other person feel terrible. I didn't get it, by the way. But anyway, but I did feel for the people, for everybody on both sides. And I would have applied as well. And I thought my projects weren't as reliant on the funding. It's so long between when you apply and when you get rejection. And for everybody, I don't care how successful they are. I think you get rejected 7 times out of 10.
That's another geometric rule
right.
of 7, 5 fingers, 7 rejections.
Not 6, not 4.
Evil 7. When you were in all the various colleges, is there any advice you held on to that really meant a lot to you?
I worked with an architect when I was in London. It was when I was quite young. It was when I would be working on large buildings and I was doing a lot of the detailing. And so it was I had to consult with a lot of people and like going through technical brochures and stuff and putting things together. I was working with this architect, Chris Lebinsky. He gave me one of the best bits of advice I've ever had. And he used to say, never assume anybody else knows what they're talking about. Always check. Always double check. Confirm it. Don't assume ever. So that's my advice. And then the other one was from, I don't know which artist said it. And they said, when you're starting out, don't be dejected by rejection because an art career is a marathon, not a sprint. And you should just keep running. They're my 2 gems.
Yeah. Do you have any other advice for anybody, any emerging artists listening today?
I think the most important thing, and it's one of the most difficult things, is get a space to work and try and get a space to work where other people are working in a group. When I came out of college in the UK and I went back into work in design, I didn't have a space to work and I couldn't afford it. There was no access to spaces. And so I went into another career. But when I finished at the Crawford in Cork, I applied for space at the National Sculpture Factory and I got a space there. And really, if I hadn't gotten that space, I couldn't have kept working. So I think it's really important to find group spaces in a facility like that if possible. But if not, even if you get together with a group of people, you learn an awful lot from that. Better to have somebody else manage it and don't get a studio space with a kitchen.
Don't get a kitchen.
No. Bad experiences with kitchens and studio spaces. I don't know if you've ever had shared studio spaces. Yeah, but don't.
Go out for lunch.
Bring your sandwiches in with you.
Walk past Notre Dame.
There's a wonderful poem by Charles Bukowski. The first line is, if you're going to do it, go all the way. He worked in the post office and then was working as a writer. But he has a few amazing poems and it's, if you're going to do it, and sometimes financially that's not possible. And life's a marathon. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but 5 years' time, you might get another chance. And I think you should never feel that if it's not immediate. And sometimes that's just life. Things don't work out, but they will further down the road. I didn't start working in art till I was well into my 40s. So life's interesting anyway.
Are there any books you'd recommend for all your books about geometry?
They are.
I want to ask you, were you really good at maths in school?
No, because geometry isn't maths, the measurement of the world, and it's very simple. I would have been good at kind of spatial reasoning, but and I would have made doll's house furniture. I could look at something and figure out how to make it when I was very young, how to make it from a flat piece of cardboard into a three-dimensional thing, from looking at, not even looking, just taking things apart and looking at them. I'm off on a tangent there.
Are there any books you'd recommend?
Books. I haven't really. I mean, either read books for the technical. I do have a lot of books on geometry and proportion, and someone's looking for those kinds of books. I think Gombrich is really good. And then Darcy Wentworth Thompson on growth and form. I think he wrote that around the beginning of the 20th century, and he was a professor of zoology, philosophy, and mathematics. So it's an amazing book about growth and form and the natural world and philosophy. I think that's a brilliant book. Otherwise, I like books on travel and logistics of travel, because I think books for me are escapism. So I love people like Margaret Atwood. I think she's just such a wonderful writer. And Enright, I think she's brilliant. I think that if you read really good writers who write about life, and you learn an awful lot from them, their observations, like Cormac McCarthy was brilliant, and Annie Proulx. It gives you a different take on things and makes you look at things a different way. But I read really for escapism, in a sense, just to go off into another world. And I tend to dip in and out of books on growth and form. I did read the whole thing, actually, because I had to do it for my thesis.
I'm curious to know, you mentioned Louise Bourgeois. Who are your art heroes or heroines, and who would you love to meet or have met, and what would you say to them, or what would you like to observe them make?
I don't know. There's a lot of artists whose work I really love. Like I love Richard Deacon's work. I love Martin Puryear. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation. And painters like Motherwell, I love his work. I don't know. If someone's very famous, I would not want to meet them, because you know so much about them. What are you going to talk about? Where are you from? But I love to hear people speak about their work. I love seeing people work when they're doing something that's incredibly skilled and seeing the end result of it. I think that's why I like Richard Deacon's work. He takes a real joy in materials, and he doesn't seem to have any sort of barriers about a kind of hierarchy of materials. He uses clay, and he uses metal, and he uses ready-made fixings, and he makes incredibly beautiful things from it and brings out the beauty in all of the pieces. I love Maud Cotter's work, but I've seen her work, seen her put things together and how she does it. I love people who are working now, and I love meeting them and discussing. I suppose the last person I went and talked about that was Mick Wilkins, who's got a forge and he makes other work as well. It was great to sit down and say, how will we address this problem? I love doing that. How will we achieve this outcome? And he'll say, we can pour it this way, we put it this way, and he'll show me something, and then I'll be saying, what about maybe doing it this way? They're the conversations I love. I really enjoy. They're kind of collaborative, working with someone, or if you're curious about how something happened or went together, and you go up to someone saying, how did you do that? And they say, you can do it this way, or you can do it that way. And it's wonderful seeing skilled workers. I love seeing people blow glass. That's quite amazing. And
You did study glass. Maybe that's going to come back in as well.
no, I couldn't afford furnace fees, and I'm glad I didn't go down that road. I think it's €1,000 a day or something. It's very expensive.
Wow.
But we did actually blow glass. Quite amazing. But no, that's outside my income bracket, I think.
And what else are you working on? What's coming up for you?
I'm involved in a project that the National Sculpture Factory initiated. It's on clay, and I'm really enjoying it, because here's this material that a lot of people have a preconceived idea about, that this is how people work with it, and it's blowing it out of the water, in a sense. There's performance and technical skills and talks and experimentation and casting and working on site, and I'm really looking forward to that. That's the last weekend in August. So that's occupied my mind, really. And then after that, I'll be off in my studio 3 days a week, I hope.
And where can people find you and see more of your work?
I've got a website. It's nualaodonovanartist.com. And I've got a piece of work in the Crawford Gallery in Cork. And there's a piece in Dublin in the museum there, and there's a piece in Belfast. And then I tend to have exhibitions, so it will really be depending on when I'm exhibiting, so it wouldn't be consistently in one place.
And you're on Instagram as well?
I'm on Instagram. I'm addicted, yes.
Addicted to scrolling?
Oh,
looking
yeah.
at it? Yeah.
I love seeing what other people are doing. And yeah, I love it actually. And because I don't have a car, I travel by public transport. And I can just be when I'm on the bus or when I'm waiting for the bus, not when I'm walking. I've resisted that temptation.
Where can people find you on Instagram?
My name, Nuala O Donovan. Yeah, easy enough to find.
And do you post a lot yourself then, if you like it? Are you like scrolling and seeing what other people are making?
I'd usually post once a week, once or twice. No, I like to look at other people's, but it really is a black hole of time. That's one of my resolutions, actually. I'm going to restrict my social media to 1 hour a day and read one of those great books.
On geometry.
Yeah.
Put the phone down now. Your hour is gone.
Yeah. Now you must read 2 hours on geometry.
Or go back to your grant application. Thank you so much for coming on, Nuala. And it has been fascinating learning about your work, and you're very generous in sharing it. I'm wishing you every success with clay. I've actually booked in a day and I'm excited to go to see that. But hopefully, for people who might miss it and are listening to this in the future, the Sculpture Factory might do things like this again, because I think it seems like a really exciting venture, and it's making it accessible to other people to go in and learn about clay and all the things that can be made. And for those who'd like to dive a little deeper, I'm going to include photos of Nuala's work and links to our social media and website in the blog post that accompanies this episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of The Warrior Artist. I'd be very grateful if you could subscribe, follow, rate, or if you have the time, even write a short review, as this really helps people find me. Wishing you all the best with your creative journey. Have a great week in the studio, and remember, you are a warrior artist.